Welcome everybody. Great to have so many people on the workshop call here this morning, and we really appreciate your taking the time to spend time with us and help inform our process as we develop this climate vulnerability assessment for Los Angeles County. I just want to start with a little bit of setting of where we are. And first, physically, of course, I want to acknowledge that these are the ancestral and unceded lands of the first peoples of this area of Los Angeles County, and we respect their elders, past and present. And we want to recognize and take a moment, especially this week when we celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, but always to recognize the Gabrielino Tongva, the Fernandinho Tatavam, the Vetureño Chumash, and the Gabrielino Quiche, who are still here and present, and we honor their stories and their culture. So I want to start with that. I also want to recognize where we are here in Los Angeles County, but across this country, recognizing the issues of race and racism and the anger, quite honestly, that I feel and the sadness that I feel about institutionalized and ongoing violence against Black people and systemic racism against people of color writ large. It's that kind of racism that really leads to the police brutality that we've seen. And it's that same driving force that leads to racial inequities that are evident across all of our aspects of daily life, from housing discrimination, education, employment discrimination, and disparate health impacts. So I want to call on my team and the county and all of our partners to continue to center equity in all of our daily work and seek out new ways to advance racial justice and to actually fight racism. So I start with that. Now, maybe setting a little bit of context for why we're even here today, why we're doing this. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that we are seeing real physical and health and emotional impacts of climate change in our communities today. We, of course, just last month experienced the highest temperatures ever recorded in Los Angeles County in Woodland Hills of 121 degrees. And even today, I think we may exceed 100 degrees in parts of LA County, and a heat advisory has been declared this late in the year. It's now mid-October, and yet we're seeing this kind of extreme heat. And this is not, by accident. This is really the result of a changing climate and the emissions that we've put into the atmosphere. I understand now that 2020 is on pace to be the hottest year on record for the planet, breaking the records that we've set in 2016. And of course, we know that the hottest years on record, most of the 10 hottest years have been in the last decade. And so we are seeing real impacts on the ground and on people. We're also, of course, seeing wildfires raging out of control. And 6 of the state's largest wildfires ever actually started this year. Of course, we know about the Bobcat fire here in Los Angeles County being the 2nd largest fire we've ever experienced in Los Angeles after the station fire of 2009. But and acknowledge that the 115,000 acres that the Bobcat fire has consumed, while large, is quite honestly a 1/10 of what the August complex fire in Northern California has consumed this year. And there are 2 other fires in Northern California that are tremendously destructive as well. So we know these things are happening. We can see them. We can smell them, quite honestly, with the smoke that's in the air, and we know that the fire season is being attenuated, with both starting earlier and going longer. And it's not just heat and wildfire, but it is also smoke that leads to air quality problems, but also the heat leads to higher levels of ozone. And so we're seeing worse air pollution than we've experienced in a long time in this region. And we know, of course, that those impacts are not evenly distributed among our population, but are in fact, there are disproportionate impacts on low-income communities and communities of color. So that's why we're here today. We want to start to identify these issues and really dig deep. And so I appreciate the opportunity to sort of set that at the basis here, at the ground. So let me just quickly talk a little bit about our agenda for today. First, we're going to do a little exercise that will help us understand who is here today, and also help you understand who is here today. So this is a little tool that we have called Mentimeter engagement, and we're gonna get to that in a moment. But really, the next part of the agenda after that is the why of doing a climate vulnerability assessment, and this is important, and I think laying some of that groundwork certainly helped, but also the scope of it, what it does contain, what it doesn't contain. I will say it's comprehensive. I will say that it is county-wide, and we're looking at both physical impacts and social vulnerability. At that point, we'll take a short break, and then we're going to go into discussion groups. And you will be assigned out into discussion groups. All of this will be explained in great detail, but you'll have 2 different discussion groups. And then we'll wrap up for the day. So again, thank you all very much for being here today. Thanks to our consulting team from Bureau Happold and Climate Resolve and ICF and all the others. And of course, thanks to my team in the Chief Sustainability Office.
Thank you so much, Gary. So right now we're going to get to know the audience. And Yama, can you go to the next slide? We have a tool that we're going to use called Mentimeter. So we're asking you all to go to your phone or to go to a desktop website and type in menti.com and then enter the code 3162189 and ask you to start answering some questions for us. So what should be on your screen is a question that says, what word comes to mind when you hear climate vulnerability? ¿Qué palabra te viene a la mente cuando escuchas vulnerabilidad climática? So I am going to switch or screen or ask Chase to come on and show what those answers are looking like live.
Yeah.
Let me.
All right. Let's go to present here. So what's really cool about this is we can see everyone's answers in real time. You can see that risk is so far the most common word, but heat and poverty are also things that come to mind, injustice being something else. So really thinking about the many dimensions in which we see this. So I'll give it a second before I continue to commentate here, because it looks like we're getting a lot of answers in. This is great, but it's also nice to see on the periphery, right? We see BIPOC is something that comes up for people, EJ communities, increasing fast, right? So these are all different ways that we might think of this concept. Day laborers, so we might be thinking of specific climate risks, or we might be thinking of people who are particularly vulnerable. So we'll give it a few more moments. This is great. it seems like heat is definitely top of mind, and injustice and the concept of equity is really important as well to the audience. Natalie, do you want me to hand it back over, or should we wait a little bit longer as this fills out a little more?
You can hand it back over to me, Chase.
Okay, I'll do that.
And I'll actually turn it over to Kristen Torres-Pauling, who's going to give an introduction to the purpose of the CVA.
Again, my name is Kristen Torres-Pauling. I'm with the County Chief Sustainability Office. I'm the Sustainability Program Director. And I am going to go over why we are doing a climate vulnerability assessment. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, well, as we're getting there, we are looking to do this climate vulnerability assessment because it's part of a charge that we were tasked when the board adopted, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors adopted our county sustainability plan. And that was in August of 2019. That plan had 159 actions for enabling the many goals in that plan, but 2 of them had specifically to do with climate vulnerability assessment. So you'll see here the language that is in the sustainability plan. Actually, they're numbered Action 28A and 28B because they're so closely related. You'll see here in the text that the first one, 28A, relates to social vulnerability and assessing climate vulnerability impacts to our social infrastructure and using that information to guide priorities for investments related to social infrastructure, like our public health preparedness, emergency planning preparedness, response planning, and community resilience. And on the next half of the slide, you'll see the other action, 28B, is about the physical aspects and physical infrastructure of and its vulnerability to climate change. So if we can understand those vulnerabilities, we hope that that data would be able to help us prioritize investment in the built environment. Next slide, please. So how would we go about doing that? As many of you are probably aware, there's a lot of existing research and plans out there that look at climate impacts, specifically in the LA region. Some of them might be statewide, but focus on LA. So there's a lot of information already out there. I'll just reference a few that are specific to Los Angeles. Here you'll see the front pages of 5 different research efforts and plans. The first is a 2019 County of LA All Hazard Mitigation Plan. That's actually a document that our colleagues in the County Office of Emergency Management put together. All counties are required to have them. They're broader than climate change, but definitely involves there. Another one is the Regional Adapt LA Plan. That is coastal impacts planning for the LA region. So thinking about sea level rise, for example. Another one is the County of Los Angeles Comprehensive Floodplain Management Plan. And that plan would be a place where we would be thinking about inland flooding related to climate change. There is the 4th climate assessment. That was a statewide effort, but there is a LA region report within that document that the state commissioned. Our office was engaged, our public health department was engaged. So we're part of that effort at the statewide level. And then there's the County of Los Angeles Department of Public Health's Climate Change and Health Equity report. That's specific to, again, our region and thinking about the health equity aspects of climate change. So those are 5 examples of existing research and plans that are specific to the same scope that we're thinking about. So we're definitely not starting in a vacuum. And this is just a small smattering of the many, many documents that we're reviewing as part of this process. Next slide, please. And just as there are a lot of reports about research and plans, there's folks who have taken that research and new data and created data tools. So we are definitely calling through those also when we are thinking about what climate vulnerability assessment would look like for for Los Angeles County. So here are some examples. The first is CalAdapt. That's a statewide tool. I use that all the time. You can click on your zip code and see by the end of the century how hot we expect it to be in a specific place. For example, another one is called the Healthy Places Index. Another one is called the Climate Smart Cities tool. Those two were put together and maintained by nonprofit groups. So that's a different example of who has been using and creating these data tools. A fourth is called CalBrace. That's a statewide tool that's focused on health indicators. And another example is the California Heat Assessment Tool, or CHAT, and that's what the visual is on the screen here. So those are 5 examples of data tools that take the information in original research and make it visualized for us. So another set of tools that we'll be drawing upon for this climate vulnerability assessment process. Next slide, please. So what do we hope to achieve by doing a climate vulnerability assessment? What's our vision? We expect a comprehensive, and probably we think the most comprehensive and broadest scope climate vulnerability assessment in the nation. That's what we expect that we'll have achieved at the end of this. And it sort of goes without saying, but we do hope it is focused on climate change and climate change impact. There's a lot of vulnerabilities out there in our uncertain world, as we certainly understand in a new way in 2020. But we are focusing on climate change for this assessment. We want what we ultimately end up with to be easily accessible to cities, community-based organizations, and the public in general. So we want it to be usable. We want it to be interactive, so that relates there, and that sort of relates to we want input as we go and even after the tool is and the report is released. And we want it to be based on a decision-first approach. And we want it to be based on incorporating centering health impacts from an equity standpoint. So does it help us make decisions? And does it, as a county, we have a lot of responsibility in the health and public health space. And our board is very focused on centering equity. So that is why we have that maybe outsized perspective that the importance of health equity and in the outcome of this project. And that is our vision for the process. Next slide, please. So I've been saying climate vulnerability assessment. What exactly does that, how are we defining vulnerability when we say climate vulnerability? So it's basically made up of 3 parts, or this is the way that we've defined it for this process. Exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So sort of technical, but essentially exposure is thinking about a physical impact, the nature and degree to either a system or a group of people and how much they are exposed to a climate impact. So that's thinking literally it is X degrees more hot now in the future. What does that have to do with our the physical piece of infrastructure and assets, or what does that have to do with a particular set of people? And we're thinking about all this in the context of both mid-century, so a couple of decades out, but also to the end of this century. Sensitivity, the next piece of climate vulnerability, is okay, so we've talked about that physical impact. So what? Is that impact harmful? Is it acutely harmful for one set of systems or people? So is there a sensitivity to that exposure? And the third piece, adaptive capacity, is the ability of that system or group of people to adjust to that climate, to adjust to climate change. Is there a lot of capacity? Is there no capacity? And what does that mean for the consequences? So essentially, how can a system or a group of people handle that, the exposure and the sensitivity. So those are the ways in which we are defining climate vulnerability for the purposes of this process. I am going to pause here and take questions before we move to our next speaker.
Yes, Kristen, so a couple of questions have come in. And the first one is, will the presentation be sent out to attendees after the call? And I can go ahead and answer that and put a link into the chat to let folks know that this session is being recorded and it will be posted onto the LA County CVA website. And then for Kristen, does the LA County plans break down to each incorporated and unincorporated jurisdictions? Have each contributed?
Was it the plan or plans? Could you repeat the question, Natalie? Sorry.
Yes, it says, does the LA County plans break down to each incorporated and unincorporated jurisdiction? Have each contributed?
Okay, I see. So the climate vulnerability assessment, it'll be at a spatial scale, and there will be reports. The sort of narrative will not necessarily be for every single city and every single unincorporated area. We have each contributed. So this is actually the very beginning of the process. So you all are contributing right now. We are having a separate city summit. So we have invited all 88 cities to have a discussion very specifically on the climate vulnerability assessment. So we do want every single city to voice how this assessment could be useful for them. We don't have RSVPs from every single city right now or every single unincorporated jurisdiction. So I can't say for certain that we'll have participation across the board, but we do have the spatial tool, the map that we'll actually end up with at the end will be usable at that sort of place-based scale.
And then can you describe the criteria for a decision first approach?
That's a good question. So I don't think we have it fully fleshed out all the way. So probably the short answer is no, I cannot fully describe the criterion that we'll be using.
Yeah, I'm on a Zoom meeting. I'm just.
Oh, sounds like somebody unmuted themselves. Unless anybody else from our team wanted to answer that, say no, we're still creating that. Okay.
You can go ahead and turn it over to Nancy, and I'll go ahead and try to answer the questions in the chat.
Great. Well, fantastic. I'd like to introduce Nancy Zuniga from IDEPSCA. I'm going to fully I want to make sure I fully introduce the organization's name, the Instituto de Educación Popular del Sur de California, or IDEPSCA. So we're really happy to have Nancy here to share a climate story from the ground when we're thinking about climate vulnerability. So I'll turn it over to Nancy. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. So glad to be part of this conversation. My name is Nancy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. IDEPSCA in English stands for the Institute of Popular Education of Southern California. My background is in public health and community organizing, and IDEPSCA is a worker center in Los Angeles that organizes and educates immigrant communities using popular education, primarily day laborers and domestic workers. So I've been asked to share a little bit about what we've learned in the last 2 years with the Woolsey fires that happened in Southern California in 2018. We have been doing on-the-ground outreach and supporting with financial relief and education around emergency preparedness for workers that were impacted in these areas. And I believe the reason I was asked to share is because in the Woolsey fires, there's a lot of untold stories that we were able to collect in speaking to over 500 workers doing low wage work in the areas impacted What we saw, unfortunately, were a lot of different gaps because most of the work that was done to support residents in the areas was for homeowners, while there were businesses and private homes that are places of work. And so what we learned in talking to workers were that there were a lot of day laborers, domestic workers, restaurant workers, and many other low-wage workers that were, in a sense, trapped in that area. I think the next slide, please. Thank you. So there are two photos for those that are checking the slides. The first photo that you can see on there is a real photo taken by a domestic worker at her place of work in a home that she was a nanny in the area. And you could see just the smoke hovering over the home. And so what we see are non-traditional outdoor workers, or not workers that we often think are working outdoors. But really when the Woolsey fires hit, yes, I will slow down. When the wildfires hit, many of these workers really had to face really responding to the fires. And so as I mentioned, we're talking about nannies, house cleaners, housekeepers, caregivers, also talking about day laborers that do a big range of jobs, gardening, construction, landscaping. And so what were some of the things that we saw? In particular, there were two main gaps that we saw. When the fires hit, communication was very complicated. We read in the after action report of the county regarding the fires that the majority of communication that was happening around what was going on in those areas was on Twitter in English. And we totally were able to confirm this because when we asked workers, how did you find out the fires were happening? They found out because they were on site, or they found out because there were road closures. They were trying to get to their place of work. So when thinking about vulnerability, for us, it was definitely a gap and an issue to think that workers that don't live in these areas had to take public transportation for hours to then potentially face being exposed to wildfire smoke or being stopped by trying to get to their place of work. And so when thinking about what could communication look like during a disaster, really thinking about who has access to this information, who is really being protected, who can be protected, and who is everyone that's in the area. So definitely for us, communication was an issue. Evacuation was also another thing connected to communication that was a challenge. We know that there were homeowners that decided to stay or to stay longer past evacuation orders. When thinking about vulnerability, we also have to think about power dynamics at play. The picture on the bottom is actually from a more recent fire last year, and it's just footage taken during in the Getty fires last year, and you can see, or maybe you can't fully see, but we were able to see in that coverage that there's workers that are there. It's not only homeowners that have to face this reality. And so what types of protections, what type of options are really available for vulnerable workers, immigrant, undocumented, potentially workers in the area. The other thing as well that we saw, so there were workers that weren't able to make it to work. But then there was also other workers that were there and that were hired, asked to do as part of their job, second responder work. We have the story of a worker, his name is Eladio, and you can find his story now on multiple sources because he's been interviewed, acting really as a first responder. He was paid to be in the area of Malibu at someone's home and with a hose protect a home and the homes nearby with a hose coming out of the pond of the homeowner. So when thinking about, and he was paid around $700 to do this. So thinking about, you know, what type of exposure, in the interview with Eladio, we asked him why did he do this, even though we pretty much imagined why. And, you know, he said he needed work. But thinking back, you know, now thinking about what actually happened during the fires, he has shared that he understands that he was really putting his life at risk at doing that. So when thinking about climate vulnerability, for us, it's really important to think about the physical impact, right? These communities are low wage, and so many will put their own lives at risk to be able to you know, get that work that's very unstable and underpaid, but also thinking about, right, that socioeconomic impact. During the Woolsey fires, there was a huge gap in the relief available to people that were impacted. And so for these workers, they were left out completely. So really, for us, it's important to think about how do we look at all these intersections, who are in these areas, and how can we really keep in mind and take an approach that includes everyone. There's a lot of gray areas when it comes to health and safety protections for outdoor workers or for non-traditional outdoor workers. In this someone mentioned the Bobcat fire. We are monitoring that right now because we know how bad the air quality is in the area, and we are already hearing from nannies that they are being asked to still take children to the park when the air quality is not good, without any PPE, and without that understanding that that's actually harmful for people's health. And so I have very much more I could share, but I want to leave it at that in case anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Nancy. We have time for maybe one question, and I'm going to look to see if there's any in the chat. So I'm going to read this one aloud. It says, Ms. Unega, in your work with your nonprofit in education, training, and emergency management, is the Amber Alert system linked to your emergency notification system and announced via cell site broadcast?
So the short answer is no. And I just want to clarify, our organization is not an emergency response nonprofit. This is something that we have been learning because our base, the communities that we serve, this was an issue. So we are really trying to work with the county, with first responders to learn how can we better support workers when these things happen. So no, the short answer is no, we don't use that. But also, when thinking about communication, for us, it's really important to think what's accessible to low-wage workers, to monolingual Spanish speakers. In our work, we do a lot of education, even on how to use the internet and how to use their smartphones. Many workers use it to text, call, and at most social media. And so, we are still trying to figure out how to best be able to provide that communication. But definitely, we are part of this conversation now because we want to be part of the solution, but also it cannot fall on on us to be able to support that.
Thank you, Nancy. And if you can drop your email into the chat, just in case anyone else has any questions. We have to move on. We are running a little low on time, but I'm going to introduce Allison from the County Sustainability Office.
Thanks, Natalie. Can everybody hear me? I think so.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Nice to speak with you. I'm Ali Frazzini, and as Natalie said, I'm with the Chief Sustainability Office. I'll be talking about the scope of the project. Next slide. So this is an overview of some of the key tasks and deliverables for the project. The team has started off with a desktop review of existing research so that we can plan for our assessment methods to build off of the existing work rather than duplicate it. And now we're starting to move into the data gathering and analytical work of the physical and social assessments. And at the end, there will be a final report that summarizes the findings for communities throughout the county. Next slide. So this slide summarizes the conditions that we're considering as part of the climate hazard assessment. We'll be looking at what might happen if the county and the world do a decent job of minimizing greenhouse gas emissions and keeping carbon out of the air. That's the RCP 4.5 scenario. And also what might happen if we keep burning fossil fuels and pumping carbon into the air. And that's the RCP 8.5 scenario. So we'll be looking at how the frequency and severity of climate hazards, just wildfire, flooding, et cetera, and the subsequent environmental conditions, such as poor air quality, could change in either scenario, both by the middle of the century and by the end of the century. Next slide. To assess the vulnerability of physical infrastructure to those hazards, we'll be mapping out the physical assets that are critical to public function in everyday life, such as energy and transportation infrastructure and emergency facilities. And we'll look at which of those physical assets will likely be exposed and how sensitive they are to those climate hazards. For example, could an electrical power station be damaged due to flooding, or what about drought? And we'll also consider the asset's adaptive capacity and mapping out which of those assets are most vulnerable. Next slide. When it comes to social vulnerability, of course, there are a variety of individual and community factors that affect the potential level of harm to people. Some of those factors relate to a person's sensitivity or physiological ability to tolerate heat or other climate hazards, such as their age or if they have any health conditions. And some factors relate to a person's likelihood of exposure to climate hazards, such as their occupation, as Nancy was talking about, or housing status, with unhoused people, for example, being very exposed to the elements. And of course, there are factors that affect an individual or community's ability to adapt and cope with climate hazards. For example, people with asthma may fare better during wildfire season if they have access to public facilities with clean filtered air. And people who work outside in the direct sun may cope better with heat if their employer gives them enough break time to take refuge in the shade. So we're trying to gather data on these types of factors and analyze who is at risk and what puts them at risk or makes it difficult for them to adapt. One way to analyze that data is similar to the physical factors, mapping out where vulnerable people live or work, which could, for example, help us identify neighborhoods where people are both concentrated and exposed to climate hazards. But we're also interested in hearing if there are other ways that we should gather and analyze information on vulnerable populations besides mapping. So among workers, for example, maybe it's valuable to know which industries or employers are riskiest and what makes them risky. So we can start thinking about industry-specific protections, which of course is how a lot of worker protections are being developed for COVID. And we don't have systematic quantitative data on all of these factors. So we're engaging a variety of people to understand lived experiences and expand on whatever technical analyses we do. Next slide. None of the vulnerability factors exist in isolation. So for example, the physical and social realms affect each other. Extreme heat is less dangerous for people who have access to air conditioning, but a lot of people who using air conditioning at the same time may strain the electrical grid. And so the social sort of effect can then impact the physical infrastructure. So knowing that a community's needs and resources for physical and social well-being are highly interconnected, the team will look across traditional boundaries to understand how the physical and social impacts of different climate scenarios might intersect or interact with each other, and to identify potential secondary and cascading impacts. And I think that's the end of my slides. Do we have time to pause for questions, Natalie?
We actually don't have time to pause for questions, and I know we're running short on time. So I'm just going to turn it over to Mentimeter so folks can have the time to answer that. And so we're going to ask people, and I'll post again in the chat, the Mentimeter information that stays there. Menti.com, the code is 3162189, and the question is, what vulnerabilities, physical and social, are of most concern? And Chase, do you want to share your screen to show some of the answers that are popping up?
Alrighty, well, here we go. I'm going to hover over the question here, because that will allow some examples, right? Underlying health conditions for social and extreme heat, older adults, wildfire evacuation, outdoor workers, and air quality from wildfires, aging infrastructure for physical housing without air conditioning. Those are all examples. So we're seeing some different examples here. So yeah, we see aging infrastructure, police brutality, health, transportation, hot classrooms, extreme heat, unhealthy air quality, lack of air conditioning, air quality, and extreme heat, right? So that's one that we've seen a couple of times. Health is a recurring theme. I saw transportation, lack of shelter, more heat, electrical infrastructure, heat in places with little or no green space. So heat, again, seems to be a recurring theme, rightfully so. It's another very warm day. Natalie, you can let me know. We can just let these scroll for a while, or we can go back to the presentation.
Thank you, Chase. I think we'll go back to the presentation, and I am taking note of the questions in here. We're going to have another pause soon. But right now I want to turn it over to Rita from the Chief Sustainability Office to talk a little bit about the rest of the CVA and the scope.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Once again, my name is Rita Komploff. I'm with the Chief Sustainability Office. Okay, so just to go over a little bit more about the project background. So this is the project schedule. As you can see, it's scheduled to take just about a year. We kicked off just a couple of months ago this summer. And this slide shows key project tasks as well as timelines, and also just how those tasks intersect with the stakeholder engagement process. So this first part of the project that we're currently in, the team is going to be focused on the climate hazard assessment as well as the desktop review. Looking at existing resources, tools, plans, and data needs, things like that. Fall 2020 through spring of next year are going to be focused on developing the physical and social vulnerability assessments. And finally, the final report and materials, as I mentioned, are expected to come out next summer, so about a year from the project start. You can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So to just talk about the stakeholder engagement, we're planning a variety of stakeholder engagement approaches throughout the project. You all are currently part of the public workshops. This is the first of two. The second one will happen towards the end of the project next year. We also have an advisory committee currently that includes about 15 members and represents a diverse group: cities, nonprofit organizations, tribal groups, businesses, academia, and people who work in the health. So in addition to this workshop, as well as the second public workshop, we are planning on having a city summit, just focused on speaking to the cities within the county and making sure that we're coordinating with them to hear their concerns. We also will be convening 5 focus groups for vulnerable subpopulations to ensure that we're hearing their concerns. That list hasn't been finalized in terms of who the focus groups will include, but for instance, it could include folks like people who have limited mobility, outdoor workers, people living in rural communities as well. In addition, we plan to conduct key informant interviews, again, sort of as needed and as feasible as we go through the process, and recognize that there are certain subpopulations that we don't feel like we've fully addressed through all the other work. And that's something that will come through in the process. So lastly, we will have our ongoing webpage, which I think has been referenced a couple of times so far. And for more information to kind of track what is going on, you can always visit that page. I think it's going to be on the screen at the very end of the presentation, unless somebody can drop it into the chat as well, but it's lacounty.gov/sustainability-project. Again, we will include that on the last slide, so you can jot it down. That webpage will include all the public workshop content from today's workshop as well as future workshop, survey links to help capture additional feedback throughout the process, and then of course ongoing notification as we have additional opportunities to engage, as well as materials that are released by the team. So you can go to the next page. Great. So lastly, I know we talked a little bit about the overall purpose of the project, but just to kind of go over some key expected outcomes that we're hoping to have from this project. We do expect to have an interactive web-based vulnerability map or maps that will illustrate the results of the assessment. In terms of knowledge and awareness, we're hoping that this project will increase awareness and climate literacy for cities, as well as supporting CVOs and other partners to inform adaptation and resilience strategies. In terms of other uses, a key goal is to support our county planning processes, as well as cities' SB 379 compliance. I think it's been mentioned earlier, but we do expect this to inform the county's safety element. We're also hoping that this will help identify infrastructure needs and funding opportunities, assist in grant applications with data, and inform emergency preparedness. So there's a wide variety of uses that we're hoping that the CVA can provide, and of course, always willing to hear from you all more ideas of how you think that this could be useful. And finally, of course, supporting vulnerable populations and potential policy changes and investments on the county level as well. All right, so with that, Natalie, I know we said we were gonna have another Q&A session. If we have time for that, we'll turn it back to you.
Yes, we do have time. Thanks so much, Rita. Let me pull up those questions. There's a couple of them. So are we looking at cardiovascular and mental health effects in populations?
So I'll take that one. I'm not sure that we have the capacity to actually sort of quantitatively model what the potential impacts on those conditions might be, but we certainly are looking at exposure among people, sort of the communities where those condition, or at least cardiovascular disease, is prevalent, and I think we can try to gather some of that information or sort of perception of what the impacts and risks might be in some of the qualitative sort of stakeholder engagement we're doing.
Thank you, Ali. And someone just dropped into the chat to look at LAPH's key indicators of health. If you want to explain that more, Susan, feel free to do that. And I want to say in the meantime, you'll see on the screen that we have another question for you at Mentimeter. It's go to menti.com and enter the code 3162189 and rank what outcomes you think would be most valuable to your organization. There's a list there for you to choose from. And then we'll have one more question that we'll take right now. How do you plan to assess the impacts of essential sectors? Will economic impacts be addressed?
I think we haven't totally figured out how we'll be looking at that, but we definitely understand that economic impacts are a major sort of type of impact from climate hazards. And we're sort of currently assessing the different potential economic indicators to look at. Does anybody else want to say more about that? that might be the best answer we have now, but if any folks that are participating have suggestions, that's why we want you involved. We would love to hear what you think is important to look at.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate the last point that Ali said, that we are looking for to you all here for you have suggestions on indicators, data sets that we should be considering. That's why part of the reason we've gathered you all here today. So thank you for your ideas in advance.
Thanks, Kristen, Ali, and I just dropped the CSO email into the chat. I know today we have a limited amount of questions, and we'll be saving the chat to take down what you're putting in there. But if you have additional questions, feel free to email the CSO at sustainability@lacounty.gov. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chase to just show the answers that have been coming in.
So we have grades of importance for folks. So it seems like the most useful things are to inform emergency preparedness and response planning. We also can see that identifying infrastructure needs for funding opportunities and supporting advocacy for vulnerable populations are very important. But it looks like a good number of folks also are looking for assistance with grant applications by using some of the data from this. And then some other folks are also looking to support with SB 379 compliance. So thank you for participating in these Mentimeters. We're saving all these results as well, so that can help inform the CVA. I'll hand it back to you, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Chase. So we're going to turn it now over to Fiona from the City of Long Beach, who has a story to share about climate vulnerability. Fiona, are you there? Let me unmute you. There you go, Fiona. You should be able to speak now.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Fiona Cabana, planning analyst with the City of Long Beach Department of Development Services. So the city is developing a climate action and adaptation plan, or CAP for short. The plan is a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, prepare the community for the impacts of climate change, improve quality of life, and enhance economic vitality in Long Beach. And it'll do this by providing a framework really for creating and updating policies, programs, practices, incentives, et cetera, for Long Beach residents and businesses to reduce the city's greenhouse gas footprint and ensure the community and physical assets are better protected from the impacts of climate change. I did have a story to share specifically about extreme heat and the Long Beach power outage that happened. And this actually, this story came out during one of our outreach events. So in 2018 to 2019, we actually held a whole year-long engagement process, reaching over 10,000 residents across 60+ activations, really focusing on meeting people where they were. But in addition to those and our open house events and our working groups, we also hosted specific forums, one being on extreme heat, which was actually in partnership with local organizations like the Long Beach Gray Panthers, the Aquarium of the Pacific, and then as well as other city departments, including our fire and health department. So for context, as you can see on the graph on the left, extreme heat projections show that the number of extreme heat days in Long Beach will actually increase from historical levels of 4 days per year to 11 to 16 days by mid-century to 11 to 37 by the end of the century. But the graph on the left shows how extreme heat isn't just a future problem, it's a current problem. And so even in just the past 10 years, we noticed that some of the most extreme heat days were in 2015. And so extreme heat in Long Beach is actually expected to impact over 275 residents. That's about half who are potentially at risk. And one of the stories that we heard from our extreme heat forum was from our older adults living in high-rise buildings. So in July 2015, I don't know if anyone on the call today is from Long Beach, but there was a power outage and high temperatures were likely a factor in the equipment failure that caused 2 power outages in downtown Long Beach, leaving residents, thousands of residents and businesses without power for days. The power outage stranded people and made it impossible to have access to medical devices or refrigeration, air conditioning, or even the use of the elevator. And this was particularly challenging for seniors or older adults living in high-rise apartments like our Park Pacific Towers. But we learned through that outreach event just the particular story about how residents in that building were actually able to connect with our community emergency response team, which are residents who go through emergency preparedness training. And these residents were able to go around and actually check in on seniors, help distribute supplies, including flashlights, food, water, as well as power generators. And really from this experience, one of the lessons that we learned was how important it was to have data like where our CERT residents are located, as well as where are our generators, or how many generators we have, but also where are they currently deployed, so that we can get them to specific apartment buildings or communities to better respond to climate events like this or other emergency response stories. But sorry, if you go to the next slide, Natalie, sorry. So we actually were able to map where our CERT residents were as part of a kind of internal data challenge that we did. And so this, we hope will be a resource not only for future climate events, but just other emergency response events in the future. But if you're interested in hearing the story firsthand from Karen, who's the senior from that kind of shared her personal story, Natalie can drop in the YouTube video of the extreme heat event as well. And then in terms of our actual CAP, we have a draft already available online. It's still in development, but our staff will actually be going to a city council study session this upcoming Tuesday, and I can drop the link for the agenda for that. But if you're interested in learning more about the CAP, feel free to go to longbeach.gov/CAPLB, or you can send questions to capcaap@longbeach.gov. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. And I think unfortunately we don't have time for questions, but what I did do is drop your information into the chat. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us. So Yema, can you go to the next slide? What we're gonna do right now is we have a short break for you to get up and stretch, but in the meantime, we're going to push you out into discussion groups. Yema, can you go to the next slide? So I think instead of a 5-minute break, we're just going to do a 2-minute break, and that will just give us time to put you in the discussion groups, and you'll be placed in there pretty soon. And we're going to divide you into 8 groups. We'll have round 1 and round 2. There'll be 2 topics that you'll be assigned from the following: drought, extreme heat, flooding, coastal and inland, wildfire. And we're going to try and do about 7 minutes per question. The facilitators and note takers are going to try to move you in those pretty succinctly. And then your division was based on your registration response to your climate impacts of most concern. So the goal is to come back around 11:53. Okay. With that, I think Chase is going to start breaking people out into their discussion groups.
Great. So thank you to all of our participants. We still have 74 folks on the live stream here. So thank you to so many of you all for spending your morning with us and into the afternoon at this point. And we want to thank our consulting team as well for doing such a great job, and thanks to the folks who stuck around and persisted to get on. So apologies for the cap. We didn't intend for that to be a capped number of participants. So thanks for your resilience in getting through to participate today. So we presented a lot of information today, and we hope we presented some dynamic and interactive opportunities to engage, but this is not the only time or opportunity to engage. We're always available over at the County Chief Sustainability Office. So our email address is sustainability@lacounty.gov. You can feel free to contact us there to talk about this project. And we will be hosting the recording and an opportunity to sign up for updates. And generally, you can find out more about the project at lacounty.gov/sustainability-projects. And as you saw in the presentation, our timeline is through 2020. We're hoping to wrap the project, but with your input and with your engagement. That's I hope you take away from today was we're very open to engaging with anybody who has experience and expertise that lived experience that it could benefit this project. So with that, I'm going to double check that we didn't miss any key points that we wanted to wrap up with today.
I'm going to ask you, Kristen, or if anyone from the CSO office wanted to share things that were coming up in their groups.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. I can share. My group, we discussed extreme heat and drought. And we actually felt that there was a lot of similarities in our responses to the different climate impacts. So the things we are thinking about as barriers and opportunities and needs for data in extreme heat were actually similar to some of the themes that we heard come up in drought. So there are distinctions, but we did find some similarities. So that's some things that I saw. I don't know if Ali or Rita wanted to share anything else.
Sure, I can share that. I think so. My group talked about heat and wildfires, and I think across both of those categories, there was a fair amount of agreement that communications about both the risks and when if something's likely to happen, communication getting out to residents or workers about that risk happening in the near future, as well as communication about resources. And maps or other information about where those resources exist are so important, and it's important for the county and other groups that are getting that information out to do so in a variety of ways and in a variety of languages and methods, so that it reaches as many people as possible, and in particular as many of the vulnerable folks as possible.
Awesome. Thank you, Ali. So again, we'll just reiterate, we're very happy to hear from anybody who wants to share more about their thoughts, or if you had a stakeholder you're like, wow, this group really has some insights and they weren't here today. The recording will be available on the website, and you can contact us at any time to share your wisdom with us. So again, thank you for joining us. Thanks to the team, and we will give you your afternoon. Have a great afternoon and weekend. Thanks, everyone.